Welcome back, everybody. Our guest today, joining us from Japan, is Professor Yoichiro Sato. Professor Yoichiro Sato holds a bachelor's degree in law from Keio University, a master's degree in international studies from the University of South Carolina, and a PhD in political science from the University of Hawaii. He currently teaches at Asia Pacific University and is the Dean of the Department and the Graduate School of Asia Pacific Studies. Previously, he has also taught at the U.S. Department of Defense's Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, Auckland University in New Zealand, Kansai Gaidai Hawaii College, and the University of Hawaii. I highly recommend Professor Sato's books if you want to understand Japan's national security policy, and his books are most insightful. His major works include The Rise of China and International Security, the U.S. Japan Security Alliance, Regional Institutions, Geopolitics and Economics of the Asia Pacific, and Re-Rising Japan. He has also written another book, Identity, Culture, and Memory in Japanese Foreign Policy, which is coming out this year. Professor Sato's Twitter account is packed with useful information and updates. His Twitter address is at Yoichiro Sato, the number 2. So I'm going to repeat that, @ YOICHIRO and the number 2. Professor Sato, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for bringing me here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I've followed you for years, and it's a thrill to finally meet you. Professor Sato, many today say that we are in a new era where national security is focused on Asia, and Japan is on the front line of the threats we face. These analysts say that the U.S.-Japan alliance is at a crossroads, and that the alliance has to decide how or what it will do to respond to a growing threat from China, as well as the Chinese agenda for the international order. Last week, on April 16, US President Biden hosted Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga at the White House, and Mr. Suga was the first foreign leader who Mr. Biden met in person, which some say was a sign of the value that the US places on the US-Japan alliance. Professor, what are some of the key takeaways from the April 16 Biden-Suga summit in Washington?
Well, I think the main key takeaway is that the US and Japan reconfirmed the primacy of this bilateral alliance between the two countries in facing the common threats they jointly perceive. But having said that, I agree with you that China is one of the primary threats the two countries are perceiving. But Japan is not the only front of the Chinese challenges to the global security order. I think China can challenge the present US order in many different fronts, multiple fronts. And just for one example, the recent news was that the Chinese naval base in Djibouti, which is on the Red Sea sea lane, is going through upgrading and now becoming capable of the stopping by the aircraft carrier. So that means the front line is actually spreading to the Indian Ocean region. So that's just one example.
Some have observed that Japan could see an uptick in the US military presence, meaning more ships, more troops, and other capabilities after the latest review of the US Japan security alliance completes. What areas do you see Japan increasing its own capabilities, and which sectors will Japan increase its defense spending?
I think two areas are probably most important in the defense of Japan's immediate neighborhood. And one is in the area of air control. Japan's the Air Force fleet is going through a major change. The F-2, the fighter support planes, which was developed in the 1990s, are reaching their retirement age, and F-35s were introduced as replacement, and the procurement is ongoing as of speaking. But Japan already started the next generation development of the stealth fighter support plane. So this is one area of the new acquisition. And the other area will be submarine warfare. Japan cannot keep up with China's quantitative buildup of the surface fleet. But in order to qualitatively counter that, the submarine warfare is a very important area for Japan. So the new Oryu class submarines, the first vessel has just been launched, and more submarine procurements are forthcoming.
Okay. So last week's summit took place a few days after China sent 25 aircraft, including fighters and nuclear-capable bombers, near Taiwan. And the joint statement that Mr. Biden and Mr. Suga released to the press after meeting together referenced Taiwan. And in their joint press conference, Mr. Suga referred to the importance of peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait. Typically, the U.S. and Japanese leaders do not issue joint statements on Taiwan. Professor, in your view, what is the significance of this reference to Taiwan?
Okay. The content of the statement per se is not very new. Both leaders, I mean, not the particular leaders, but the Japanese leaders and American leaders have independently issued speeches and statements of similar contents. And neither the US nor Japan have agreed to the China's sovereignty claim over the island of Taiwan. And even on the policy of, the Chinese policy of one China principle, the US and Japan's, the best they came with this statement was they understand the PRC has a policy of one China. And the understanding does not equate supporting or agreeing to it. So as far as Japan and the US are concerned, the sovereignty question over the island of Taiwan has always been an open question since the nationalist was defeated on the mainland.
Many analysts talk of Washington's missile gap with Beijing, and they note how Beijing has increased its capabilities of warfighting and denying other powers from sailing in regional waters without cost. The US is seeking to fill this gap and increase its various naval, amphibious, and expeditionary capabilities. We are likely to face a situation where Japan could be asked by the US to host long-range missiles, a proposal that will probably be very controversial amid the Japanese public. How do you see this playing out?
I think hosting US long-range missiles on the Japanese soil will be, I think it's beyond the political possibility. And especially, the China has many intermediate range missiles, and many of them are nuclear capable as well. And if you're talking about countering the nuclear missile threat, then the US missiles also need to be nuclear tipped, and deploying them onto Japanese soil would violate the three non-nuclear principle. So I would immediately rule out the deployment of nuclear tipped missiles, but even with conventional warheads, the deployment of the intermediate range missiles onto the Japanese soil is going to be very difficult, because Japan's defensive defense orientation is really restraining the Japanese self-defense force from obtaining offensive capability, first strike capabilities. So for them, in the current ongoing debate about the missile defense, some politicians are urging for acquiring limited the ground attack missile capabilities in order to disrupt the what they call kill chain, and in order for China to launch missiles against Japan, they need to have various facilities interconnected, not just the missile launcher itself, but radars and other control, satellite networks and so forth. So some limited attack capability to disrupt this connection has been debated in Japan, but Suga said they will come to a conclusion of this discussion by the end of December last year, and it's been postponed. And I don't think the debate will resume until the election this fall, or maybe possibly sooner. And even after that, will Suga be a prime minister? That's a big question mark already. And will the LDP hold the majority and control the government? Nobody knows. So this debate has been constantly pushed off, and I don't think it will resolve very quickly. And bringing up the U.S. deployment of the ground attack missile capability in this context is just a political suicide for Japanese Prime Minister.
Okay. At the April 16 joint news conference, President Biden shared that the U.S. and Japan will invest together in digital competitiveness in areas such as 5G, AI, quantum computing, genomics, and semiconductor supply chains. Professor Sato, can you share with our audience what concerns Tokyo and Washington have that have led them to want to work closely together in these fields?
Yeah, China has identified the electronics and advanced technology in their national strategy for security, and China is willing to invest the government resources into propping up these strategically important industries and challenge the current dominance of the American, Japanese, and to some degree Korean companies in those areas, especially the semiconductor technology. So if we allow China to be technologically independent, and not only independent, but possibly superior to us, then China can use that to its advantage in a strategic competition against the US and Japan. So I think the the Trump administration first brought it up, not so much in a very comprehensive way. I think more general strategic rivalry came first, and Trump instructed his ministers, I mean his secretaries, to identify where U.S. can hit China, and each department came up with a possible list of, the areas where the U.S. can hit China. So with on that continuum, I think the Biden administration is pursuing this technological competition against China, and the kind of strategic economic policy to cut off China from the supply chain of these electronics products in order to disrupt China's efforts to develop indigenous electronics technology. At the moment, China is only producing the lowest technology semiconductors, and more advanced semiconductor chips are produced by Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and the US, especially in the processing of the information. So if those allies can jointly dominate the technology, then China cannot surpass.
Okay. Typically, Japan does not weigh in on human rights issues in other countries. Yet, Mr. Suga addressed concern over human rights in China during his trip to Washington last week, particularly as it related to Xinjiang with the Uyghur Muslims, as well as Hong Kong. What prompted this change?
Okay, that's a very good question. Japan has historically played a kind of intermediary role between China and on one hand, and the United States and European countries on the other, when it came to the issue of human rights and democracy. And oftentimes, Japan's economic interest in China are cited for this kind of intermediating role, but I think it's also in terms of development ideology, Japan sees itself somewhat distinct from Europe or the United States. And Japan is more Asian in that sense, thinking that without a proper economic development, democracy cannot take roots. Even if you try to introduce democratic systems such as elections and rule of laws and so forth, they're not going to take roots in poverty and conflict. So with that kind of thinking, Japan has been fairly soft on authoritarian governments in Asia in the past. But in regard to China, that is changing partly because Japan sees China has already achieved a reasonable degree of economic development. And as a nation, China's economy is greater than Japan. Although on the per capita basis, China is poorer than Japan. But Japan has already terminated the ODA loans for big infrastructure projects in China back in 2008. So Japan sees China as not quite a developed country, but no longer a developing country, somewhere in between. So it's time for China to behave more like the developed Western countries.
Okay. Mr. Yoshihide Suga has been Prime Minister of Japan since September of last year, after Japan's longest serving Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, resigned due to ill health. What is the public's view of Mr. Suga's job performance thus far, on handling the economy, COVID-19, the Olympics. And we do have later this year in the fall elections coming up. And who, in your view, will be the contenders who will seek the prime ministership?
That's $1 million question. Well, first of all, Suga's popularity has really dwindled. He started out quite high in Abe's legacy, but he went down very quickly. And I don't think the recent summit meeting with President Biden helped him much. So the LDP is going to face a very tough election if they go into election with Suga, but which is probably necessary because the calendar is packed with many important events, including the Olympic Games. But even the prospect of the Olympic Game is now very unclear as Tokyo go into the fourth wave of the coronavirus pandemic, and Suga and Tokyo Governor Koike are using this. The COVID, well, I should say Koike is using it as a munition against challenging Suga's leadership. So with all these complications, it's very difficult to predict who's going to be the successor of Suga. But among the current LDP ranks, Kono has already expressed he's interested in the future leadership. Kishida, who didn't get Abe's endorsement in the last round, he has not lost interest either. And I'm not sure about Ishiba. Ishiba performed so poorly last time, and it may have ended his chance, but he has not said he's not going to try again. So he might try again. So within LDP, those three plus some others, newer faces. And Koike, I think, is a wild card outside LDP.
Okay.
She might plan, rejoining LDP in some way and get some support. And so it's a very complicated situation right now.
So it sounds like a fluid situation.
Yes.
What measures have been taken by Mr. Suga to support the Japanese economy during the pandemic?
Okay. Well, the government has been trying to balance economy, employment on one hand, and the controlling of the pandemic on the other. And so Japan has not done any strict lockdown. So even during the first three waves, the businesses were only encouraged to either close or in the first wave closing, but second and third wave, they were encouraged to shorten their business hours. So, and the government is coming up with a scheme to subsidize those the restaurants and bars who consent to this regulation. So the law has been put in place to enable the subsidization, but it's quite inconvenient when the restaurant closes at 8 p.m. After work, I often want to eat, but they're closed. But Japan will not go into a strict lockdown without a new enabling legislation. Currently, there is no legal authority anywhere to do that. So that is the extent of the government response.
I see. Okay. A recent Japan Press Research Institute survey found that 70% of Japanese respondents think that the Olympics should be postponed or canceled due to concerns over the spread of COVID. In your view, Professor Sato, what is the likelihood that a decision will be made to cancel the Olympic Games?
I think there is a fair chance of that happening, given that the daily infection counts in Tokyo and Osaka are, rising, and Osaka has entered a critical state in terms of the hospital bed availability for those with severe symptoms. So if this fourth wave doesn't, wrap up quickly, then Japan will not be in a state to host the Olympic Games. Just looking at the vaccination availability, Japan started vaccinating the medical professionals last month in March, and vaccination of senior citizens above 65 years old was supposed to start in May, but it's a little bit delayed, and they don't have enough vaccines to implement this, across the whole nation. So the government just announced that they're going to prioritize the senior citizens in the worst infection areas, meaning currently Osaka, Tokyo, Hyogo, and Kyoto.
Mm.
So senior citizens in other prefectures are not going to get it anytime soon.
Mm.
And forget about the younger people, we don't know when they get hold of vaccines.
Mm.
So in that state, allowing many visitors for the Olympic game is going to be very difficult. Doing Olympic game without audience, that's one option which they have been talking about, but I'm not sure if they will do that.
I see. Okay. A question for you about the Quad. In recent years, ties have been strengthened among the Quad, the four-country coalition devoted to freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific. In your judgment, is the Quad in need of changes? And secondarily, what has been Japan's motivation to involve itself with the Quad?
Okay. Well, let me start with Japan's motivation. Yeah, Japan was a key promoter of this Quad concept. You can, go back to like 2007, 2008, when Abe was prime minister first time. He talked about the security diamond, and the diamond connected the U.S. Pacific Command headquarters in Honolulu, Tokyo, Canberra, and India. So this is the Quad concept back then, and the Prime Minister Aso also talked about the coalition of democracies, and again the same for countries: U.S., Japan, Australia, India. So the idea was there, and then the first Quad meeting, happened, but Australia pulled out. The concept was dormant for about a decade until Abe resurrected it in his meeting with President Trump, and Trump adopted some of Abe's vocabulary, like FOIP, free and open Indo-Pacific language, was adapted from Japanese to the U.S. strategic document. So for Japan, the key idea is to anchor the U.S. commitment to the region and also network the U.S. allies of Japan and Australia. And about these three, the idea was already there back in the 1990s when Japan and Australia promoted the trilateral security dialogue with the United States, and that cooperation existed. So the new idea in the Quad is, of course, the addition of India, and this is because India is a growing power with strong relevance to maritime security in the Indian Ocean region. But also, as we are kind of preoccupied with strong China economically and militarily, the next economic giant in Asia will be India. India is projected to surpass China somewhere by the middle of this century. So with this kind of long-term vision, including India on the side of the trilateral cooperation was very important for Japan. So that's Japan's incentive. Okay. And the first part of the question, should the Quad change?
Right.
Yeah. I'm not sure. At the moment, it is a kind of loose network, a dialogue framework, not quite an alliance, but with growing security cooperation, either among the four parties or among three of the members, and sometimes with additions of other partners like France. So should that change? In what direction? Take in more partners or become more formalistic? And I think it's going to be a path-dependent event. And if China, threaten its neighbors more, then the coalition will grow in terms of membership and become more formalized. But if China refrains somehow, then the Quad coalition will remain loose. That's my take on this.
Okay. So you are a longtime observer of the Indo-Pacific. If you could give 3 pieces of advice to U.S. President Joe Biden on his Indo-Pacific policy, what would that be?
I think the U.S. Indo-Pacific policy under the Trump administration was first very much heavily influenced or pretty much dominated by the Defense Department thinking. And then, the Secretary of State Pompeo, as a very unique secretary, came in and started playing role in this. The Biden administration should broaden the participants of thinking what is Indo-Pacific for the United States. They should involve, more State Department officials. They should involve the economic departments, trade representatives, commerce departments, and have more comprehensive approach to the Indo-Pacific idea. That would be the first advice to President Biden. And second advice, I think the multilateralism, especially the perception of Quad among the Southeast Asian countries is very important. Without their cooperation, the Quad is not going to function effectively. So that's the second point. And third point, I think, to realize there are limitations to India's participation in this concept.
Mm.
And if you don't understand that well, then Quad will fail. And same about the Quad Plus idea. The U.S. is really going into love affairs with Vietnam these days, the Defense Department in particular. But again, this relationship has limitations. Vietnam has its own agenda. So, you cannot throw all eggs into this basket.
Mm.
And working with other Southeast Asian countries to diversify, U.S. partnerships in Southeast Asia is extremely important.
Okay. Which areas can China and Japan improve collaboration in your view? Are there any areas where Beijing and Tokyo can work together?
I would say environment.
Mm. Okay.
It's a win-win area. China has really neglected its own environment in addition to, doing harm globally. And China is willing to accept cooperation in improving its, environmental, control.
So you published a book this year, Identity, Culture, and Memory in
Yes.
Japanese policy.
Yeah, it's a co-edited book with Dr. Michal Kolmash
Mm.
in Czech Republic.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you share with us what some of the main currents of thought are in that book?
Yeah. Basically, the last 2 decades, there have been publications on Japanese foreign policy from the constructivist perspectives, meaning that not only material interests, but various ideas and values do matter in foreign policy. Those authors came from liberal side and heavily emphasized the Article 9, the Peace Constitution, to explain the limitation of Japan's security policy. But then Abe came in and pretty much crushed their arguments. Wait a minute, Japan can do these things. And so we are trying to modify the constructivists' approach by making the argument that ideas can be from a more realist side. There are conservative ideas, and those conservative ideas are not new. They have always been around, and the Abe is a manifestation of that. So in a sense, we are arguing that Abe is not a surprise. Yeah, it was predictable.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So in addition to your own book, can you recommend any other books on Japan that we should be reading right now to understand it better?
Yes, the recent books by Sheila Smith, Andrew Oros, I can't remember the book titles off my head, but they're very good.
Okay.
So I strongly encourage readers to read that.
Good. Are there any books on China that have come out in recent years that you would recommend?
How recent? Maybe like Aaron Friedberg.
Okay.
And I have several in my office, and if I walk, I could pick them up and see. But yeah, I have a Friedberg book right here.
Okay.
I can show it to you. The Contest for Supremacy. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a great book.
Good.
Yeah. And I can't remember other books off my head. The authors' names, they're not my friends, so
Okay,
the names don't necessarily register in my head.
sure.
Yeah.
So please tell us about Asia Pacific University.
Yes. Yeah. Ours is a part of the Ritsumeikan Educational Trust, which is centered around Kyoto and nearby prefectures. But the Ritsumeikan decided that we needed a new international campus with a totally new concept that only 50% of the students will be Japanese
Mm,
and the other half will be internationally recruited.
mm,
And the same about the faculty members. Only 50% of the faculty members will be Japanese nationals and the other half international.
okay.
And when it comes to faculty, even I'm a Japanese national, but I lived overseas for over 20 years, so it's not some colleagues think I'm non-Japanese. So anyway, with this kind of new concept, we are running this new university, which is only 20 years old, away from Kyoto, but on the island of Kyushu,
Mm,
in a hot spring capital of Beppu.
mm,
And students will come here and stay, live together in international, dormitory, mixed dormitory, Japanese and international students for 4 years and cooking together, studying together, doing club activities together. And and the second concept is students come from diverse many countries.
mm.
And our target is 100 countries.
Wow.
But currently, we counted the nationalities of our students, and the number has been hovering around 90.
Mm,
So
mm,
we are almost there.
yeah.
So this is a great environment to teach international relations because when you talk about, uh, whatever countries, we have students from those countries
Yeah.
who can give you their first-hand experience.
Yes.
And currently, the incident in Myanmar,
Mm,
the coup and, many deaths of civilians,
mm,
you know, I can really emphasize because I have many Myanmar students
mm,
and some of them had to go back home,
mm,
upon the graduation in this, current circumstance. It really aches my heart.
mm. What are those countries where you have the most students? Where do they tend to come from?
The main sources, I would say China, Korea, Indonesia,
Okay.
Vietnam,
Mm,
and which is the first? Maybe Thailand
okay.
and or Bangladesh also is fairly big, and India is a really growing source for students,
Mm,
and some Central Asian countries also, like Uzbekistan
mm.
and the many European countries, even Latin American and African countries too.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Uh, I know in the 90s, when I had the pleasure of studying in Japan, there were a fair number of students from those countries you mentioned, particularly South Korea and China, but also a number from Russia. Do you get students from Russia as well?
Not many.
Okay,
Occasionally we do, but for some reason we I don't know, maybe we are not very active yet in Russia.
I see. Okay. I just know at the 90s, many Russians came and studied at
I
different
see.
Japanese universities. So interesting.
Ah.
Can you share with us, Professor Sato, any plans that you may have to write a new book or perhaps a new upcoming article?
Yes, articles are quite unpredictable because requests come quite promptly. But I have two ongoing book projects,
Oh,
and one is a comparative narratives about the ongoing pandemic.
oh, Okay.
So different countries narrate the pandemic differently
Yes.
and trying to explain why
Mm.
from both international politics perspective and domestic politics perspective. So that's one project.
Yeah.
And the other project is a comparative take of the Indo-Pacific concept by countries in the region.
Okay.
So how Japan sees Indo-Pacific idea, how the Europeans see this idea, how India sees the idea, how Australia sees the idea, how the Americans see the idea. So that's another project.
Very timely.
Yes.
Now, you've written so many impactful books and articles over your career. When you write, where do you typically write? Do you write in your office or at home or somewhere else?
Uh, Both at home and at office, sometimes at the airport. Not the last 1 year, but when I was traveling often,
Okay.
yeah, in between flights
Hmm.
and airport lounge. Yeah,
Is there a particular time of day or night that you write?
that is quite unfixed because I usually don't have a very strong drive to write. And so I'm just procrastinating and, I may be sitting, but I'm like snacking on. but, uh, but sometimes, I have like real urge to write.
Mhm.
And then I just skip everything, including meal, shower, bathroom. Forget it. I'm writing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's where I write.
Now, when you write, you said you sometimes snack.
Yeah.
So, what do you eat? What do you snack on?
Oh, pretty much everything, like potato chips, chocolate, and all the bad stuff.
So, you're in Japan and you're snacking. You don't snack on osenbei at all?
Sometimes, yes, I do.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, well, good. And, it may take a while, but at some point, travel will open up again
Yes.
and tourists will return to Japan, Americans among them. For those future visitors to Japan, what are two or three locations that you would suggest?
Ooh, I see. Well, the typical tourists would flock to popular destinations like Kyoto, or maybe, some more knowledgeable ones would go to Hiroshima
Mhm.
in addition to Tokyo,
Mhm.
but not beyond that.
Yeah.
And I would really recommend some rural destinations throughout Japan. The Tohoku area, is not only about the disaster 10 years ago, but there are a lot to see there.
Mm.
And Hokkaido ski resorts are really famous among Australians and New Zealanders. They even built up some villages there because they love it so much.
Wow.
And Kyushu hot spring is just great, and the culture of shochu,
Oh, yes.
yes, yeah, alcoholic beverage,
Yeah.
and yeah, so Japan's diversity is something to see.
Sure. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's important. Okay, good. And other than sushi, which we all know about and love, is there a particular Japanese dish that you would suggest future visitors try when they come to
you
Japan?
know, if you start experimenting the broad range of ramen,
Mm,
it's gonna become a lifetime hobby.
yeah, that's
Yeah, I mean,
um,
it's as deep as wine, I would say.
Yeah. No, I think you're right about that. It's its
Yeah,
own world.
yeah.
Hmm.
And it doesn't cost as much as you know, drinking those good wine.
Yeah, that's right. It's more affordable.
Yeah.
And where in Japan are you from?
I'm originally from the Kanto area. I grew up in Kanagawa.
Okay. And where in Kanagawa, may we ask?
Kamakura?
Kamakura. Oh, wow. A
Yes.
beautiful place.
Yes.
And then lastly, what made you want to study and later on write and teach about geopolitics and national security policy? How did you get started on that path?
Hmm. I was very much interested in international affairs by the time I was in high school. And in my final year in college, I had a chance to go to America for language study. I enrolled myself in English language school for half an year and met some. My conversation partner was a PhD student in international relations, and we would go to a bar and chat about international affairs in English, and that was my good practice. And by then, I wanted to do graduate study, so I stayed in South Carolina for the following years for my master's degree, and I met my great mentor, Professor Robert Angel, who was an expert of Japanese foreign policy and domestic politics as well. And under his tutorage, I completed my master's degree and I decided to pursue a PhD degree. And luckily, University of Hawaii offered a scholarship, so I could continue to study there.
Well, you've had a very important career, and we thank you for your scholarship and really appreciate you taking the time for this interview. Thank
Thank
you.
you very much. Thank you very much.